Is Emily Carr's art Canadian? Well, yes, of course, but it depends what you mean by that. Of course, Emily Carr is in fact a Canadian icon, widely cherished for her bohemian and unpretentious persona, breeding dogs, camping in mosquito-infested forests in her caravan, the Elephant, and playing the role of cranky landlady when finances demanded, during her long years of artistic isolation during her mid-career. Most of all, though, she is cherished for her brilliantly painterly evocations of the forests and skies of British Columbia and her attempts to preserve in painting the cultures of Canada's Indigenous West Coast peoples. But as we have all come to understand more deeply over the course of the past few decades of scholarship and debate, Carr is a deeply messy figure, stranded between cultures and worlds. Self-appointed as understander-in-chief in the bitterly racist colonial society of her day, her celebration of Indigenous peoples and cultures can now strike us as maternalistic, despite the courage it took to take that stance in her time. Carr's protestations to the contrary, these were not her people. In fact, what we have here is a Haida guide here with her, Carr, of course, the ever-present Billy, the dog, and then this prudish-looking, shadowy creature under the parasol is her chaperone, who was sent along to make sure that she didn't get into trouble. Yet also, as a first-generation Canadian that Carr was, both her parents were British-born and a very Anglophilic household she grew up in, as a first-generation Canadian, neither did Emily Carr belong to the British culture of her parents. This is why Carr can be understood as the quintessential Canadian artist. She belongs precisely nowhere. And this, in fact, is the unspoken theme, I would argue, of her art. Trying to belong, negotiating a place in a country that she, unlike her group of 7 contemporaries, vividly understood to be occupied by people whose histories and lives mattered. Caught between worlds, but belonging fully to none, she is the exemplar of the Canadian settler condition. So let's start at the beginning. Carr's girlhood watercolors. Her first subject, other than her early dainty flower paintings and family likenesses, are her repeated depictions of the Indigenous canoes in the harbor around the bays and waterways of her native Victoria. It's a subject that she returned to again and again, as if compelled by this other way of being in or of belonging to the landscape. There's a yearning here to slip the constraints of her race and gender, to get out there. With the death of her parents, she was able to follow that yearning, heading off to art school in San Francisco from 1890 to 1893, and on her return, she began in earnest her explorations up the coast of BC to visit the villages of BC's First Peoples. By 1900, though, she was off again to London this time, where she studied at the Westminster School of Art. And here you can see her coping with the oversight of her very crusty-looking British male art teacher. She would end up staying in England for 5 years, first in London, and we see her here and all of his browbeaten female students along with her, and I think along with him, and I think this is the figure of Carr. She has a horrible way of caricaturing herself in these cartoons. She then goes off from London and studies with Julius Olson in St. Ives, and here's an outtake from her series of works in which she shows herself in her tweedy cloak and tam o'shanter, walking into the woods on a reconnaissance mission for a subject that would be a mainstay of her career, the forest. But these, she ultimately felt, were not her forests. These were not her trees. And after a period of time spent in a sanatorium in Norfolk, where she was recovering from a nervous breakdown, she returns to the west coast of Canada. Again, not for long, though. Come 1910, she was up and out again, this time to Paris and various locations in the French countryside. And during her time in France, she was exposed to the brilliant color and the pulsating rhythms of Fauvism, as you can see in this luscious landscape painting. Returning to Canada for good at the end of 1911, she's now 40 years of age. So for someone who was devoted to the landscapes of British Columbia, I note that she spent a lot of time getting away from British Columbia. But now at the age of 40 years of age, she takes this Fauvist approach to painting and she applies it to the landscapes of home, creating these vivid paintings of the villages that so fascinated her. She was aiming to record sites that were rapidly changing. The poles and house structures were rotting and falling into the bush with no one to replace them. These indigenous communities had been decimated by the spread of smallpox during the closing decades of the 19th century, and Carr was paying attention. She tried, in fact, to sell all of her large-scale watercolors and oils to the province of BC as a record of these places and these cultures, but she was bitterly disappointed when they declared her work too artistic to be of documentary use. As well, a commercial exhibition in Vancouver of her Fauvist-inspired work was a bust, and in 1913, Carr decided to throw in the towel. For 15 years, dog breeding and boarding house keeping in Victoria would be her reluctant focus, and she set aside, although she did like dogs, and she set aside all her hopes of pursuing her artistic vision. But all that changed suddenly in 1927, when a chance visit from the ethnographer Marius Barbeau connected her to the National Gallery of Canada. The result was her inclusion in the exhibition West Coast Art, Native and Modern, in which her art and that of other settler artists, from A.Y. Jackson to Anne Savage, were displayed alongside objects made by Northwest Coast peoples, some of which we now know had in fact been confiscated during the potlatch ban. The legacies of this important landmark exhibition would require an evening of its own to untangle, but it did trigger a sudden interest in Carr's work in the Eastern Canadian art world, and it did enable her to connect to Lauren Harris. This would prove to be a mutually beneficial relationship, with each artist supporting and encouraging the other to follow their own path toward a spiritual art. At this point, she embarked on a roughly 3-year period of intense artistic activity as she produced large-scale oil paintings for this new Eastern market. These run the gamut from some of her finest and most evocative works, such as Harthouse's Kitwinkle Totems, to works that teeter uneasily on the brink of kitsch. Three Totems is one of the oddest of these, with its weirdly congested space. The objects seem to be cut adrift from their context, crudely warehoused, and we want to really wonder what she was driving at with this really perplexing image. This prolific period comes to an abrupt close, though, when Carr decides to follow Harris's advice and leave behind her indigenous subjects, which she does abruptly, finding her own relationship to place. And this, in my view, is the culminating moment of her career. In ecstatic images of sea and sky and trees reaching into the swaying heavens, she tells us that she has achieved her sense of belonging at last. Yet the roots of this triumph lie not in her connection to indigenous cultures, as is sometimes assumed, but in her thorough assimilation of the international art that she had seen in her travels, particularly on her trip to New York in 1930, when she saw the work of leading modernist painters such as Georgia O'Keeffe, who I think we can see O'Keeffe's presence in the tree trunk. Georgia O'Keeffe said, Carr said, I don't know what to make of Georgia O'Keeffe, all this talk about sex, and I think that it's all completely beside the point, and then she comes home and paints Georgia O'Keeffe trees, so, history will be the judge. She met Georgia O'Keeffe at Alfred Stieglitz's Gallery 291, where O'Keeffe was showing the Black Orchid series, which are some of her sexiest, darkest, best paintings. Carr also visited the museums and paid a call at the home of the Vanguard art collector, Catherine Dreyer, and saw all the most up-to-date works that were being made on both sides of the Atlantic. The work of Vincent Van Gogh also caught her attention, and she wrote to a friend that she had to admit that Van Gogh was onto something. But so was she, as we can see here, this incredibly beautiful seascape, and it's one of many that she made during this period. These very important interactions with the international art of her day unleashed her confidence, but so too did her immersion in the literary work of the British Romantic poets and the work of the American poet Walt Whitman, who had long been one of her favorites. Here are her copies of Leaves of Grass, which are all of her books that were with her at her death are held in the archives of the Royal BC Museum in Victoria. And they're heavily annotated. She has several versions of different iterations of the publication of Leaves of Grass. I've just chosen two examples to look at here. The one on the right was one of my favorites when I came upon it. The passage that she's annotating is Whitman's writing about riding on horseback. And she says, "Oh, the horseman's and the horsewoman's joys, the saddle, the gallop, the pressure upon the seat, the cool gurgling by the ears and hair." And she writes, "I've felt it." So anyone who wonders about Carr's sensuality need look no further. That's wonderful. What becomes clear was that to fully realize her Canadian vision, she relied deeply on the catalytic effect of non-Canadian art and literature. And this is perhaps her most Canadian attribute, that hybridity of vision. So, these paintings seem to me to be, 50% Whitman, 50% Van Gogh, and 100% Emily Carr. There is that kind of vortex of energy here that you see in both Whitman and Van Gogh, swirling around her, embracing her, that connection between the individual soul and the forces of nature that we find in both those artists kind of come together with Carr's DNA here, I think. So here is Carr once again in her elephant, the image we started out with at the beginning. But I'm also showing you as well to the left the caravan of British modern painter Augustus John, whose notoriously bohemian lifestyle would have in fact been well known to Carr during her student years in England. And perhaps this is another source of inspiration for Carr's way of life that was so instrumental to her being able to make the paintings that she made. Carr drew from many sources, near and far, to feed her Canadian imagination. She is a cultural mutt, like so many of us whose families have come to Canada from somewhere else, whether this year or a century ago. Like Carr, we are all trying to figure this place out and how we might somehow belong to it together. Many thanks.